Welcome to the Deep Dive, the Theopoetics Edition. We are Dr. Aaron Waldron, founder and CEO of Corvus Cantus, a theopoetic publishing house and creation of Lost Raven Studios. What you're hearing right now is an expansion. The original Deep Dive podcast has been a space shaped and supported by AI, a place where ideas are explored, questions are sharpened, and insight is generated through emerging technology. But this edition marks a widening of that circle. Through our partnership between Corvus Cantus and the Deep Dive podcast, the Theopoetics Edition becomes a threshold space, where artificial intelligence meets sacred imagination, where technology intersects with myth, poetry, theology, and embodied reflection. Here we focus intentionally on theopoetics. We teach, we inform, we remember, we draw from Theopoetics and the publishings of Corvus Cantus, the books, the dialogues, the voices inhabiting the liminal spaces between doubt and devotion, critique and creativity. This is not systematic theology. This is not rigid dogma. This is theology felt, spoken, questioned, reimagined. In a meta-modern age, where we oscillate between irony and sincerity, fragmentation and hope, Theopoetics offers a way forward, not by resolving tension, but by inhabiting it. So whether you are a writer, a seeker, a scholar, or simply someone holding an old smelly box of inherited beliefs, this space is for you. Welcome to the Deep Dive, Theopoetics Edition. Let's begin.
Imagine trying to build a house out of smoke. You lay down a foundation of fog, you try to stack these columns of vapor, and then, the moment a breeze rolls through, the entire structure just dissolves.
Right. It's gone.
Exactly. It sounds completely impossible, right? But what if someone told you that the deepest truths of your life, your trauma, your sudden moments of joy, your most profound spiritual awakenings, what if they aren't made of bricks at all? What if they are made of smoke?
That is such a wild concept to wrap your head around.
It really is. And welcome to the Deep Dive, especially to you, the learner, whether you're listening on your commute or, making dinner or just trying to satisfy that insane curiosity of yours. We are incredibly thrilled you're here.
Absolutely. So glad you're joining us.
Today, our mission is to explore this fascinating text from 2026 that completely dismantles the way we usually think about certainty. It's called Truth in Smoke, a collection of Theopoems by Dr. Aaron C. Waldron. And we're going to look at how this author takes all those rigid, boxed-in explanations of faith and replaces them with something that dances and shifts and leaves a trace on your soul.
Yeah, and to really grasp how ambitious this collection is, it helps to look at the publisher behind it, Corvus Cantus.
Oh, right.
Yeah, they're this publishing house that sits right at the intersection of, myth, spirituality, and language. They aren't interested in printing textbooks or rule manuals for how to be a good religious person.
No 10-step guides to enlightenment.
Exactly. They focus on works that try to evoke the sacred rather than just explain it flat out.
Yeah.
And Waldron uses poetry, metaphor, and this deeply physical symbolism to engage with just the sheer mystery of the divine. It's an approach that entirely refuses to hand you a simple list of doctrines.
That distinction between evoking and explaining is so important. But before we get into the actual meat of what Waldron is arguing about the world, we really have to talk about how they're communicating, and specifically who is speaking to the reader. Because right out of the gate, there is this stylistic choice that, it completely stops you in your tracks.
Oh, it really does. When you open this collection, you realize Dr. Waldron, who uses they, them pronouns, by the way, actively rejects using the singular first-person I throughout the entire text.
Yeah, it's almost entirely from the collective we.
Right, and it isn't a royal we either. It's a deeply theological statement.
It's so jarring at first. You keep waiting for the author to step forward as the solitary narrator, but they just refuse to do it. Why make that choice?
Well, the author describes themselves as a shaman in journey. And this choice of the collective we, it reflects a core belief that human personhood is never an isolated, standalone thing.
Okay, right.
Who you are right now listening to this is shaped by your community, your ancestors, your memories, and all the countless voices that form the human spirit. Waldron is writing from the premise that you literally cannot separate the individual soul from the collective experience of humanity.
Wow. And that interconnectedness, it brings us directly to the foundational metaphor of the entire book, right? The title itself, Truth in Smoke.
Yes. And to understand the smoke, we have to talk about the methodology here. The author uses something called theopoetics.
Theopoetic sounds very academic.
It does, but it's a fascinating movement. In the book's appendix, Waldron references thinkers like Ruben Alves and Catherine Keller. They pushed back against the idea that theology should be this rigid, systematic discipline where everything has to be, categorized with perfect doctrinal precision.
Like it's a science experiment or something.
Exactly. Theopoetics argues that talking about God or meaning shouldn't sound like a legal contract. It should be an imaginative, creative, fluid exploration.
So if traditional dogmatic theology is like studying a fossil, something rigid, set in stone, completely unchanging, then theopoetics is like trying to study the wind. Or in this case, smoke.
That's a great way to put it.
You can't hold it, you can't pin it to a corkboard, but you can undeniably smell it and feel its effects. It proves that a fire or some kind of transformation is actively happening. But let me ask you this. If you're listening to this and you're someone who loves a spreadsheet, right? Someone who anchors their life in clear facts and hard evidence, this has to sound incredibly frustrating.
Oh, absolutely.
How do we ground ourselves if the truth just keeps drifting around like vapor?
Well, that frustration is completely valid. But the text argues that this fluid approach isn't just a stylistic preference. It is an absolute survival mechanism.
A survival mechanism.
The problem with building a theology or a worldview out of rigid, solid certainty is that it shatters the second it hits the hardest part of the human experience.
Which is trauma. The glass box just breaks.
It shatters into a million pieces. If your belief system is a fragile glass box of perfect answers, the whole good things happen to good people and everything happens for a reason, mindset trauma acts as the hammer.
Right.
These smoke metaphors introduced because trauma itself is rarely linear or logical. When a person experiences deep pain, the memory of it doesn't play back in their mind like a perfectly edited documentary.
No, it comes back in fragments.
Exactly. It's a sudden smell in a room or a flash of panic, a physical sensation. It haunts the body, much like, smoke lingers in a room long after the fire is out.
Before we go deeper into that, it's probably worth noting for you, the listener, as we trace this smoke, Waldron is stepping into some intensely heavy, politically charged waters here.
Yep.
And our goal today isn't to debate the politics of these issues or, to take a stance on them.
Right, we're not endorsing a political platform.
Exactly. We are just impartially exploring the landscape the author is painting and looking at how Waldron uses these systemic issues to map out a completely new theology. Just wanted to make that clear.
That's an important caveat. And Waldron's landscape is unapologetic. They treat trauma not just as a psychological defect to be medicated away, but as a primary theological landscape.
A theological landscape.
Yeah, for Waldron, the sites of our deepest suffering are actually the places where our most authentic questions about God and meaning emerge.
You see this mechanism work so vividly in the poem To Be a Drop. The imagery is just haunting. The author asks us to imagine being a single drop of water, and we follow this drop through different scenes of profound human suffering.
It's a very visceral poem.
It slides down a glass, witnessing a mother violently abusing a child. Then it shifts, and it's a drop of blood hitting the floor after an act of physical violence. Then, and this is the stanza that really locked me in, it becomes a drop of sweat sliding down someone's hand during a terrifying panic attack, but inside a church.
Yes.
And finally, it's a tear falling at a funeral.
Taking that specific image of the panic attack inside the church, the author is really highlighting a profound and tragic dissonance. A church is culturally designated as the ultimate sanctuary, right? The place of ultimate safety.
Right.
By placing an uncontrollable, terrifying biological trauma response right in the pews, Waldron is asking us to confront what happens when the institutions built to protect our souls actually become the environments that trigger our deepest anxieties. The divine presence isn't hovering above the panic. The divine is inside that drop of sweat.
Wow. And the text doesn't just leave that trauma at the individual level either. Waldron scales that feeling of unsafety all the way up to the systemic level in poems like War and A Slave's Trauma. They completely reframe the concept of war.
They do. It's no longer just about international conflicts or tanks or borders. War is redefined as the crushing weight of systemic oppression.
Yeah.
The collection heavily criticizes colonized religion, specifically pointing out the historical and psychological damage of enforcing a white Anglo-Saxon Jesus onto marginalized people around the world.
Right. And the critique in War focuses on the absurd contradictions of modern society. Waldron describes a world that can mobilize to give out free COVID vaccines on every corner, but simultaneously charges impoverished communities for basic drinking water and basic healing.
Exactly. And in Slave's Trauma, the text delves into epigenetics and generational memory. Waldron argues that the horrors of chattel slavery aren't just history book facts. They're an active, haunting presence. Over 200 years later, that trauma still fundamentally alters how marginalized people form their identities, how they move through public spaces, and even how they attempt to find physical rest.
But wait, I'm struggling with this framing a little bit. It's intense to take everyday societal struggles, even really hard ones like fighting for healthcare, dealing with high gas prices, or navigating systemic poverty, and label that a literal war. Does throwing that word around risk diluting the concept of war? Like, aren't we insulting people who are in actual combat zones where buildings are being leveled?
That's a very fair pushback, and it's a heavy word choice. But the text anticipates that discomfort. Waldron uses the word war to force a conversation about normalization.
Normalization of what?
Of violence. We've been conditioned to accept certain forms of systemic violence, like the fact that people die because they can't afford insulin, as just the way things are. It becomes background noise. By labeling the daily, grinding struggle for physical and spiritual survival as a war, the author is trying to jolt the reader awake.
Ah, I see.
It's a deliberate provocation.
Yeah.
Waldron is saying that for marginalized communities, just existing requires a battlefield mentality, even when the violence is administrative rather than explosive.
So if the traditional sanctuary is a place of panic attacks and the broader society is a systemic battlefield, what does this all mean for where we actually look for the sacred? Like, where does a person go to find God when the traditional avenues feel weaponized?
They go to the places that haven't been institutionalized. The author leaves the cathedrals and the mountaintops behind, and instead they look for the divine in the kitchen and on the harsh concrete streets of New York City.
This is where the collection gets so wonderfully grounded. Let's talk about the poem Mi Pastelón. For anyone listening who hasn't had the pleasure, a pastelón de plátano maduro is this incredible Caribbean casserole. It's made with sweet, ripe plantains, savory seasoned beef, and layers of melting cheese.
It's amazing.
In the poem, the author is smelling this dish cooking, and they write that God actually emerges right there, hidden underneath the melting cheese.
The alchemy of that poem is brilliant. Waldron discusses the secret recipe of pastelón. On a practical level, it's a dish born out of necessity. It was created by ancestral slaves and colonized people who had absolutely nothing but oppression, brutal labor, and the cheapest, most limited ingredients available to them.
Right.
But they took those scraps and created something nourishing and beautiful.
They turn survival into art.
And that is the theological statement. The author realizes that the deep interconnectedness of that historical ancestral pain, mixed with the present visceral joy of smelling that meal in your kitchen today, that connection itself is the divine. God isn't a distant observer of the pain. God is the resilience that turns the pain into sustenance.
It democratizes the holy. Like, we are so used to thinking of the divine as this VIP experience that requires a strict dress code, a specific ornate building, and a heavily guarded theology enforced by a priest.
Yes, the velvet rope of religion.
Exactly. But Waldron takes the sacred out of the VIP section. God is in the smell of garlic and sazon. You don't need a permit. You don't need to pass a theology exam. You just have to be present in your own kitchen.
And that exact same democratization is carried out the front door and into the streets of New York City. Waldron reimagines the entire city as a living, breathing, spiritual text. In a poem called The Village, the author is walking through a predominantly queer and non-binary neighborhood. And they describe feeling God's presence radiating through a trans person's third chakra.
Just really quick, for the listener who might not be familiar with that terminology, the third chakra, the solar plexus, is generally understood in Eastern traditions as the energy center associated with personal power, self-worth, and individual identity.
Right. So by placing the feeling of God's presence specifically in the energy center of a trans person's self-worth, Waldron is making a profound statement of divine validation. God emerges on the sidewalk not as a judge holding a clipboard of rules, but as an affirming presence that makes marginalized bodies feel safe, seen, and inherently beautiful.
Then there's the poem A Bike Ride, which completely fascinated me. It's just a narrative about riding a bicycle up a massive, grueling hill in New York traffic.
Sounds stressful.
You can feel the physical agony in the words, the burning in the calves, the lungs screaming for air, the taxi drivers honking and yelling. But when the author finally reaches the top of the hill, the taste of their own salty sweat transforms the moment into a spiritual rebirth. It becomes a baptism.
The physical exertion in that poem acts as a mechanism to break down the ego. When you are in that much physical distress, pushing your body to its absolute limit, All the intellectual noise and anxiety of the city just burns away.
Yeah.
You are reduced to breath and muscle. And in that raw, stripped-down state, the sweat stinging your lips isn't just gross city grime, it's the waters of baptism.
Right.
It's proof that you are alive and that you survived the climb.
Which flows perfectly into the poem Bench by the Hudson. The idea of communion is usually this highly structured ritual, right? A wafer and wine and an altar. But Waldron reimagines it. Communion is simply sitting on an empty park bench in the shade, tearing off a tiny piece of a croissant and sharing it with a restless city bird.
The tension there between alienation and belonging is so compelling. New York City is chaotic, brutally expensive, and exhausting. The text explicitly points out that it's a city largely built by marginalized people who can now barely afford to exist in it.
Yeah, that's so true.
It is an alienating environment. But within that concrete fragmentation, these tiny, quiet flashes of the sacred emerge completely unannounced. You just have to be paying attention.
So we've traced the smoke from the shattering trauma of systemic war into the warmth of a Caribbean kitchen and out onto the concrete of the city. But the author doesn't stop there. The journey of redefining God takes another massive leap, moving away from the highly physical world and stepping into the infinite.
Right. The final chapters of the collection introduce the concept of the sacred feminine and what Waldron calls the ocean of God. This is where the poetry takes direct aim at patriarchal religious structures that have dominated Western theology. And we see this most sharply in the poem Christa, where the author imagines a female Christ figure.
It's an incredibly heavy, striking poem. It directly references feminicida, the targeted systemic murder of women, specifically focusing on a woman of color who was murdered in Mexico.
The poem draws a direct, unavoidable parallel between the state-sanctioned execution of Jesus by the Roman Empire and the murder of this woman by a patriarchal society. She is described as yesterday's mother, who transforms into today's savior, executed by a combination of law, apathy, and fear.
Wow.
By taking a marginalized, vulnerable female body and placing her at the absolute center of the Christ narrative, Waldron insists that any authentic spirituality must center the suffering and the resilience of women. The divine is no longer a distant, untouchable, masculine ruler sitting on a throne. The divine is deeply, intrinsically entangled in the vulnerability of the feminine.
And that vulnerability, that vastness, leads us into the final defining imagery of the entire book, water. We move from smoke to the ocean of God.
To really unpack this, we have to look at a concept the book's appendix explains called apophatic theology.
Okay, epiphatic theology. That sounds like a term I'd need a graduate seminary degree to casually drop in conversation. Break that down for us.
I know it sounds intimidating, but it's actually a very grounding, almost relieving concept. Epiphatic theology is essentially the theology of unknowing.
Unknowing.
Yeah, it's the idea that God, or the ultimate reality, is so infinitely vast and complex that any attempt to define God, precisely giving the divine strict names, genders, or behavioral boundaries, actually reduces God. Every time you build a linguistic or doctrinal box to put God in, the box is instantly too small. You understand God better by acknowledging what God is not, rather than arrogantly claiming you know exactly what God is.
Which brings us right back to the central metaphor. It's the smoke. It's the inability to catch it and put it in a Tupperware container.
Exactly. The final poems shift the metaphor from smoke to the deep ocean to represent this infinite, uncontainable mystery. In a poem called A Drowned Certainty, Waldron asks a deeply radical question. What if the God you knew was never meant to float? Certainty is heavy. Let it sink.
The imagery there is wild. The poetry describes the reader dropping down into the water, descending to a place where language literally sheds its skin because words no longer work. It compares the experience to a scuba diver exploring the dark ocean floor who suddenly drops their flashlight into the abyss. You're completely enveloped in what Waldron calls the dark water.
And society trains us to panic in the dark. But the text explicitly argues that dark water isn't inherently evil or scary. It is just deeply misunderstood. It represents the murky, uncharted waters of our own souls. We have to dive into that darkness without the artificial flashlight of our rigid certainties to actually find the hidden things that will ultimately increase our inner light.
But I have to ask about the practical application of this, because there's a beautiful but genuinely terrifying line in this final section. You were never called to be right, only to be a lost well.
Yeah.
If you are listening to this and you're someone who anchors your entire life in having a plan, knowing the facts, and being right, how do you practically apply this idea of letting your certainty sink without feeling completely panicked and adrift?
Well, letting go of the need to be right is an ego death, and it is terrifying. But the text suggests a shift in perspective. When you stop frantically kicking and exhausting yourself trying to stay afloat on your tiny, fragile raft of absolute certainty, and you finally just let yourself sink into the mystery, you realize a profound truth.
What's that?
You aren't drowning, you're actually being held. You are suspended in an ocean that is vastly bigger, older, and more complex than your human understanding. You stop needing to name every single drop of water perfectly, and instead, you just allow yourself to become part of the current. It's about trading the exhausting anxiety of having to defend all the answers for the quiet awe of simply existing within the question.
It's a complete paradigm shift. It takes theology from being a rigid math problem you have to solve on a chalkboard and turns it into a deep-sea dive.
That is the exact invitation of the book.
Man, let's take a moment to look back at the massive landscape we've covered today. We started with this deeply disruptive idea that truth isn't a brick, it's smoke. It is uncatchable, it refuses to stay in the neat little boxes we build for it, but it is undeniably real. We followed that smoke as it drifted through the dark, fragmented realities of human trauma, recognizing the invisible war of systemic injustice that marginalized people navigate every single day.
Right.
We watched that same smoke curl through the warmth of a kitchen making pastelon, revealing that God can be found under melting cheese, and we traced it through the noisy, chaotic streets of New York City, where a grueling bike ride becomes a baptism. And finally, we watched it drift out over an infinite feminine ocean of God, where we are invited to let the heavy, exhausting weight of our need to be right simply drown.
It is a stunning reimagining of what it means to seek the sacred in the modern world. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you, the learner, with one final thought to mull over as you step back into the rhythm of your day. Throughout our conversation, we've thought of smoke as representing the unpredictable, shifting, and ungraspable nature of truth. But consider the practical reality of smoke. It is also the very thing that guides you to the fire. When you are lost in the dark, whether you're navigating the heavy, fragmented weight of personal trauma, or just feeling overwhelmed by the sheer chaos of modern life, what if the shifting, confusing smoke of your doubts isn't a sign that your faith or your truth is burning to the ground? What if that smoke is the exact signal leading you back to a warmth that can actually sustain you? Keep your eyes on the smoke.